I was 5 years old, nearly 6, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. I remember seeing it on TV, and everyone being happy. I didn't know why we were so happy, just that we were. I was aware of the fact that there was a thing called apartheid.
Apartheid.
Apartheid, and it was ending, and that was a big deal. But I didn't understand the intricacies of it. Intricacies of it. I didn't understand the intricacies of it. What I do remember, what I will never forget, is the violence that followed. The triumph of democracy over apartheid is sometimes called bloodless revolution. It is called that because very little white blood was spilled. Black blood ran in the streets. As the apartheid regime fell, we knew that the black man was now going to rule. The question was, which black man? Spate of violence broke out between the Inkatha Freedom Party and the ANC, the African National Congress, as they jockeyed for power. The political dynamic between these two groups was very complicated, but the simplest way to understand it is as a proxy war between Zulu and Xhosa. The Inkatha was predominantly Zulu, very militant and very nationalistic. The ANC was a broad coalition encompassing many different tribes, but its leaders at the time were primarily Xhosa. Instead of uniting for peace, they turned on one another, committing acts of unbelievable savagery. Massive riots broke out. Riot. Massive riots broke out. Thousands of people were killed. Instead of uniting the peace, they turned on one another, committing acts of unbelievable savagery. Massive riots broke out. Thousands of people were killed. Necklacing was common. That's where people would hold someone down and put a rubber tire over his torso, pinning his arms. Then they'd douse him with petrol and set him on fire and burn him alive. The ANC did it to Inkatha, and Inkatha did it to the ANC. I saw one of those charred bodies on the side of the road one day on my way to school. In the evenings, my mom and I would turn on our little black and white TV and watch the news. 12 people killed, 50 people killed, 100 people killed. Eden Park sat not far from the sprawling townships of the East Rand, Tokoza and Katlehong, which were the sites of some of the most horrific Inkatha. and Gotha, which were the sites of some most horrific and Gotha ANC clashes. Once a month at least we'd drive home and the neighborhood would be on fire. Hundreds of rioters in the street. My mom would edge the car slowly through the crowds and around blockades made on flaming tires. Nothing burns like a tire. It rages with a fury you can't imagine. As we drove past the burning blockades, it felt like we were inside an oven. I used to say to Mom, I think Saturn burns tires in hell. Whenever the riots broke out, all our neighbors would wisely hole up behind closed doors, but not my mom. She'd head straight out, and as we'd inch our way past the blockades, she'd give a rioters this look. Let me pass. I'm not involved in this shit. She was unwavering in the face of danger. That always amazed me. It didn't matter that there was a war on our doorstep. She had things to do, places to be. It was the same stubbornness that kept her going to church despite a broken down car. There could be 500 riders with a blockade of burning tires on the main road out of Eden Park, and my mother would say, get dressed. I've got to go to work. You've got to go to school. But aren't you afraid? I'd say. There's only one of you and there's so many of them. Honey, I'm not alone, she'd say. I've got all of heaven's angels behind me. Well, it would be nice if we could see them, I'd say, because I don't think the readers know they're here. No, they're there. She'd tell me not to worry. She always came back to the phrase she'd lived by. If God is with me, who can be against me? She was never scared, even when she should have been. That careless Sunday we made our circuit of churches, ending up as usual at White Church. When we walked out of Rosebank Union, it was dark and we were alone. It had been an endless day of minibuses from mixed church to black church to white church, and I was exhausted. It was 9 o'clock at least. In those days, with all the violence and riots coming on, you did not want to be out that late at night. We were standing at the corner of Jellicoe Avenue and Oxford Road, right in the heart of the wealthy white suburbia, and there were no minibuses. The streets were empty. I so badly wanted to turn to my mom and say, you see, this is why God wanted us to stay home. But one look at the expression on her face, and I knew better than to speak. There were times I could talk smack to my mom. This was not one of them. We waited and waited for a minibus to come by. Under apartheid, the government provided no public transportation for blacks, but white people still needed us to show up to mop their floors and clean their bathrooms. Necessity being the mother of invention, black people created their own transit system, an informal network of bus routes controlled by private associations operating entirely outside the law. Because the minibus business was completely unregulated, it was basically organized crime. Different groups ran different routes and they would fight over who controlled what. There was bribery. Bribery bus routes controlled by private associations, different routes, and they would fight over who controlled what. There was bribery. And general shadiness that went on. A great deal of violence and a lot of protection money paid to avoid violence. The one thing you didn't do was steal a route from a rival group. Drivers who stole routes would get killed. Being unregulated, Minibuses were also very unreliable. When they came, they came. When they didn't, they didn't. Standing outside Rosebank Union, I was literally falling asleep on my feet. Not a minibus in sight. Eventually, my mom said, "Let's hitchhike." We walked, and after what felt like an eternity, a car drove up and stopped. The driver offered us a ride, and we climbed in. We hadn't gone 10 feet when suddenly a minibus swerved right in front of the car and cut us off. A Zulu driver got out with an iwisa, a large traditional Zulu weapon, a war club. Basically, they're used to smash people's skulls in. Iwisa. He's a war club. Basically, they're used to smash people's skulls in. Another guy, his crony, got out of the passenger side. They walked up to the driver's side of the car we were in, grabbed the man who'd offered us a ride, pulled him out, and started shoving their clubs in their face. "Why are you stealing our customers? Why were you picking people up?" It looked like they were going to kill this guy. I knew that happened sometimes. My mom spoke up. "Hey, listen, he was just helping me. Leave him. We'll ride with you." That's what we wanted in the first place, so we got out of the first car and climbed into the minibus. We were the only passengers in the minibus. In addition to being violent gangsters, South African minibus drivers are notorious for complaining and arguing. Harangue. To speak to someone or a group of people after a long time in a forced angry way, especially to persuade them. South African minibus drivers are notorious for complaining and haranguing passengers as they drive. The driver was particularly angry one. As we rode along, he started lecturing my mother about being in a car with a man who was not her husband. My mother didn't suffer lectures from strange man. She told him to mind his own business, and when he heard her speaking Xhosa, that really set him off. The stereotypes of Zulu and Xhosa women were as ingrained as those of the men. Zulu women were well behaved and dutiful. Xhosa women were promiscuous. Promiscuous and unfaithful. And here was my mother, his tribal enemy. A Xhosa woman alone with 2 small children, one of them a mixed child, no less. Not just a whore, but a whore who sleeps with white man. "Oh, you're Xhosa," he said. "That explains it. Climbing into strange men's cars. Disgusting women." My mom kept telling him off and kept calling him her names, yelling at her from the front seat, dragging his finger in the rear view mirror, and growing more and more menacing. Menacing. Mixed child, giving him kept calling her names, yelling her off, yelling at her from the front seat, wagging his finger in the rearview mirror, and growing more and more menacing until finally he said, "That's the problem with you, Xhosa woman. You're all sluts, and tonight you're going to learn your lesson." He sped off. He was driving fast and he wasn't stopping, only slowing down to check for traffic at the intersections between speeding through. Death was never far away from anyone back then. At that point, my mother could be raped. We could be killed. These were all viable options. I didn't fully comprehend the danger we were in at the moment. I was so tired and just wanted to sleep. Plus, my mom stayed very calm. She didn't panic, so I didn't know to panic. She just kept trying to reason with him. I'm sorry if we've upset you. You can just let us out here. No, really, it's fine. We can just walk. No. He raced along Oxford Road. The lane's empty, no other cars out. I was sitting closest to the minibus sliding door. My mother sat next to me, holding baby Andrew. She looked out the window at the passing road and then leaned over to me and whispered, "Trevor, when he slows down at the next intersection, I'm going to open the door and we're going to jump." I didn't hear a word of what she was saying, because by that point I'd completely nodded off. When we came to the next traffic light, the driver eased off the gas a bit to look around and check the road. My mother reached over, pulled the sliding door open, grabbed me, and threw me out as far as she could. Then she took Andrew, curled herself in a ball around him, and leaped out behind me. It felt like a dream until the pain hit. Bam! I smacked hard on the pavement. My mother landed right beside me, and we trembled and tumbled and rolled. I was wide awake now. I went from half asleep to what the hell? Eventually, I came to a stop and pulled myself up, completely disoriented. I looked around and saw my mother already on her feet. She turned and looked at me and screamed, "Run!" So I ran, and she ran, and nobody ran like me and my mom. It's weird to explain, but I just knew what to do. It was animal instinct. Learned in a world where violence was always lurking and waiting to erupt. In the townships, when the police came swooping in with their riot gear and armored cars and helicopters, I knew. Run for cover. Run and hide. I knew that as a 5-year-old. Had I lived a different life, getting thrown out of a speeding minibus might have faced me. I have stood there like an idiot going, "What's happening, Mom? Why are my legs so sore?" But there was none of that. Mom said, "Run," and I ran, like a gazelle runs from a lion. I ran. The men stopped the minibus and got out and tried to chase us, but they didn't stand a chance. We smoked them. I think they were in shock. I still remember glancing back and seeing them give up with a look of utter bewilderment on their faces. What just happened? Who'd have thought a woman with 2 small children could run so fast? They didn't know they were dealing with the reigning champs of Maryville College Sports Day. We kept going and going until we made it to the 24-hour patrol station and called the police. By then, the men were long gone. I still didn't know why any of this had happened. I'd been running on pure adrenaline. Once we stopped running, I realized how much pain I was in. I looked down, and the skin on my arms was scraped and torn. I was cut up and bleeding all over. Mom was too. My baby brother was fine though, incredibly. My mom had wrapped herself around him, and he'd come through without a scratch. I turned her in shock. "What was that? Why were we running? What do you mean? Why are we running? Those men were trying to kill us. You never told me that. You just threw me out of the car. I did tell you. Why didn't you jump? Jump? I was asleep. So I should have left you there for them to kill you? At least they would have woken me up before they killed me." Back and forth we went. I was too confused and too angry about getting thrown out of the car to realize what had happened. My mother had saved my life. As we caught our breath and waited for the police to come and drive us home, she said, "Well, at least we're safe, thank God." But I was 9 years old and I knew better. I wasn't going to keep quiet this time. "No, Mom, this was not thanks to God. We should have listened to God when He told us to stay at home when the car wouldn't start, because clearly the devil tricked us into coming out tonight. No, Trevor, that's not how the devil works. This is part of God's plan. And if He wanted us here, then He had a reason. And on, there we were, back at it, arguing about God's will. Finally I said, "Look, Mom, I know you love Jesus, but maybe next week you could ask Him to meet us at our house, because this really wasn't a fun night." She broke out in a huge smile and started laughing. I started laughing too, and we stood there, this little boy and his mom, our arms and legs covered in blood and dirt, laughing together through the pain in the light of a petrol station on the side of the road in the middle of the night. Apartheid was perfect racism. It took centuries to develop, starting all the way back in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company landed at the Cape of Good Hope and established a trading colony, later known as Cape Town, a rest stop for ships traveling between Europe and India. To impose white rule, the Dutch colonists went to war with their natives and ultimately developing a set of laws to subjugate and enslave them. When the British took over the Cape Colony, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers trekked inland and developed their own language, culture, and customs, eventually becoming their own people, the Afrikaners, the white tribe of Africa. The British abolished slavery in name but kept it in practice. They did so because in the mid-18s, in what had been written off as a near-worthless wave station of the route to the Far East, a few lucky capitalists stumbled upon the richest gold and diamonds reserves in the world, and an endless supply of expandable bodies was needed to go in the ground and get it all out. As the British Empire fell, the Afrikaner rose up to claim South Africa as a rightful inheritance, to maintain power in the face of the country's rising and restless black majority. The government realized they needed a newer and more robust set of tools. They set up a formal commission to go out and study institutionalized racism all over the world. They went to Australia, they went to the Netherlands, they went to America. They saw what worked, what didn't. Then they came back and published a report, and the government used the knowledge to build the most advanced system of racial oppression known to man. Apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. A full compendium of those laws would run more than 3,000 pages and weigh approximately 10 pounds. But the general thrust of it should be easy enough for any American to understand. In America, you have the forced removal of the native onto reservations, coupled with slavery, followed by segregation. Imagine all three of those things happening to the same group of people at the same time. That was apartheid.
Apartheid.
Born a crime. I grew up in South Africa during apartheid, which was awkward because I was raised in a mixed family, with me being the mixed one in the family. My mother, Patricia Noah, is black. My father, Robert, is white, Swiss or German, to be precise, which Swiss German invariably are. During apartheid, one of the most crimes you could commit was having sexual relations with a person of another race. Needless to say, my parents committed that crime. In any society built on institutionalized racism, race mixing doesn't merely challenge the system as unjust, it reveals the system as unsustainable and incoherent. Race mixing proves that races can mix, and in a lot of cases want to mix, because a mixed person embodies that rebuke to the logic of the system. Race mixing becomes a crime worse than treason. Treason? Treason, showing no loyalty to your country, especially by helping its enemies or trying to defeat its government. Race mixing becomes a crime worse than treason. Humans being humans and sex being sex. That prohibition never stops anyone. There were mixed kids in South Africa 9 months after the first Dutch boats hit the beach in Table Bay. Just like in America, the colonists here had their way with the native women, as colonists so often do. Unlike in America, where anyone with one drop of black blood automatically became black, in South Africa, mixed people came to be classified as their own separate group, neither black or white, but what we called colored. Colored people, black people, white people, and Indian people were forced to register their race with the government. Based on those classifications, millions of people were uprooted and relocated. Indian areas were segregated from colored areas, which were segregated from black areas. All of them segregated from white areas and separated from one another by buffer zones of empty land. Laws were passed prohibiting sex between Europeans and natives, laws that were later amended to prohibit sex between whites and all non-whites. The government went to insane lengths to try to enforce these new laws. The penalty for breaking them was 5 years in prison. There were whole police squads whose only job was to go around peeking through windows, clearly an assignment for only the finest law enforcement officers. And if an interracial couple got caught, God help them. The police would kick down the door and drag the people out, beat them, and arrest them. At least that's what they did to the black person. In the white person, it was more like, look, I'll just say you were drunk, but don't do it again, huh? Cheers. That's how it was with a white man and black woman. If a black man was caught having sex with white women, he'd be lucky if he wasn't charged with rape. If you ask my mother whether she ever considered the ramification of having a mixed child under apartheid, she would say no. She wanted to do something, figured out a way to do it, and then she did it. She had a level of fearlessness that you have to possess to take on something like she did. If you stop to consider and ramifications, you'll never do anything. Still, it was a crazy, reckless thing to do. A million things had to go right for us to slip through the cracks the way we did for as long as we did. Under apartheid, if you were a black man, you worked on a farm or in a factory or in a mine. If you were a black woman, you worked in a factory or as a maid. Those were pretty much your only options. My mother didn't want to work in a factory. She was a horrible cook, and never would have stood for some white lady telling her what to do all day. So true to her nature, she found an option that was not among the ones presented to her. She took a secretarial course, a typing class. at the time, a black woman learning how to type was like a blind person learning how to drive. It's an admirable effort, but you're unlikely to ever be called upon to execute the task. By law, white-collar jobs and skilled labor jobs were reserved for whites. Black people didn't work in offices. My mom, however, was a rebel, and fortunately for her, her rebellion came along at the right moment. In the early 1980s, the South African government began making minor reforms in an attempt to quell international protest over the atrocities and human rights abuses of apartheid. Among those reforms was the token hiring of black workers in low-level white-collar jobs like typist. Through an employment agency, she got a job as a secretary at ICI, a multinational pharmaceutical company in a suburb of Johannesburg. When my mom started working, she still lived with my grandmother in Soweto, the township where the government had relocated my family decades before, but my mother was unhappy at home, and when she was 22, she ran away to live in downtown Johannesburg. There was only one problem: it was illegal for black people to live there. The ultimate goal of apartheid was to make South Africa a white country. The ultimate goal of apartheid was to make South Africa a white country, with every black person stripped of his or her citizenship and relocated to live in the homelands, the Bantustans, the semi-sovereign black. Sovereign, semi-sovereign black terrorists that were in reality puppet states of a government in Pretoria. But this so-called white country could not function without black labor to produce its wealth, which meant black people had to be allowed to live near white areas in the townships. Government planned ghettos built to house black workers like Soweto. The township was where you lived, but your status as a laborer was the only thing that permitted you to stay there. If your papers were revoked for any reason, you could be deported back to homeland. To leave the township for work in a city or for any other reason, you had to carry a pass with your ID number, otherwise you could be arrested. There was also a curfew. After a certain hour, blacks had to be back at home in the township or risk arrest. My mother didn't care. She was determined to never go home again, so she stayed in town, hiding and sleeping in public restrooms until she learned the rule of navigating the city from the other black women who had contrived to live there, prostitutes. Many of the prostitutes in town were Xhosa. They spoke my mother's language and showed her how to survive. They taught her how to dress up in a pair of maid's overalls to move around the city without being questioned. They also introduced her to white men who were willing to rent out flats in town. A lot of these men were foreigners, Germans and Portuguese, who didn't care about the law and were happy to sign a lease, giving a prostitute a place to live and work in exchange for a steady piece on the side. My mom wasn't interested in any of such arrangement, but thanks to her job, she did have money to pay rent. She met a German fellow through one of her prostitute friends, and he agreed to let her a flat in his name. She moved in and bought a bunch of maid's overalls to wear. She was caught and arrested many times for not having her ID on the way home from work. For being in a white area after hours, the penalty for violating the pass laws was 30 days in jail or a fine of 50 rands. nearly half her monthly salary. She would scrape together the money, pay the fine, and go right back about her business. My mother's secret flat was in a neighborhood called Hillbrow. She lived in the number of 203. Down the corridor was a tall, brown-haired, brown-eyed Swiss German expat named Robert. He lived in 206. As a former trading colony, South Africa has always had a large expatriate expatriate. South Africa has always had a large expatriate community. People find their way here. Tons of Germans, lots of Dutch. Hillbrow at the time was a Greenwich village of South Africa. It was a thriving scene, cosmopolitan and liberal. There were galleries and underground theaters where artists and performers dared to speak up and criticize the government in front of integrated crowds. There were restaurants and nightclubs, a lot of them foreign-owned, that served a mixed clientele. There were galleries and underground. There were restaurants and nightclubs. A lot of them are foreign-owned, that served a mixed clientele. Black people who hated the status quo, and white people who simply thought it ridiculous. These people would have secret get-togethers too, usually on someone's flat or in empty basements that had been converted into clubs. Integration, by its nature, was a political act, but the get-togethers themselves weren't political at all. People would meet up and hang out, have parties. My mom threw herself into the scene. She was always out at some club, some party, dancing, meeting people. She was a regular at the Hillbrow Tower, one of the tallest buildings in Africa at the time. It had a nightclub with a rotating dance floor on the top floor. It was an exhilarating time, but still dangerous. Sometimes the restaurants and clubs would get shut down, sometimes not. Sometimes the performers and patrons would get arrested, sometimes not. It was a roll of the dice. My mother never knew whom to trust, who might turn her into the police. Neighbors would report on one another. The girlfriends of white men in my mom's block of flats had every reason to report a black woman, a prostitute, no doubt living among them. And you must remember that black people worked for the government as well. As far as her white neighbors knew, my mom could have been a spy posing as a prostitute, posing as a maid, sent into Hillbrow to inform on whites who were breaking the law. That's how a police state works. Everyone thinks everyone else is the police. Living alone in the city, not being trusted and not being able to trust, my mother started spending more and more time in the company of someone with whom she felt safe, the tall Swiss man down the corridor in 206. He was 46, she was 24. He was quiet and reserved, he was wild and free. She would stop by his flat to chat. They'd go to underground get-togethers, go dancing at the nightclub with the rotating dance floor. Something clicked. I know that there was a genuine bond and a love between my parents. I saw it, but how romantic their relationship was, to what extent they were just friends, I can't say. These are things a child doesn't ask. All I do know is that one day she made her proposal. I want to have a kid, she told him. I don't want kids, he said. I didn't ask you to have a kid. I asked you to help me to have a kid. I just want the sperm from you. I'm Catholic, he said. We don't do such things. You do know, she replied, that I could sleep with you and go away and you would never know if you had a child or not. But I don't want that. Honor me with your yes, so that I can live peacefully. I want a child of my own, and I want it from you. You will be able to see it as much as you like, but you will have no obligations. You don't have to talk to it. You don't have to pay for it. Just make this child for me. For my mother's part, the fact that this man didn't particularly want a family with her, was prevented by law from having a family with her, was part of the attraction. She wanted a child, not a man stepping in to run her life. For my father's part, I know that for a long time he kept saying no. Eventually he said yes. Why he said yes is a question I will never have the answer to. 9 months after that yes, on February, my mother checked into Hillbrow Hospital for a scheduled C-section delivery, estranged from her family. Pregnant by a man who could not be seen in public, she was alone. The doctors took her up in the delivery room, cut open her belly, and reached in and pulled out a half-white, half-black child who violated any numbers of laws, statutes, and regulations. I was born crying. When the doctors pulled me out, there was an awkward moment where they said, that's a very light-skinned baby. A quick scan of the delivery room revealed no man standing around to take credit. Who is the father? They asked. His father is from Switzerland, my mother said, referring to the tiny landlocked kingdom in the west of South Africa. They probably knew she was lying, but they accepted it because they needed an explanation. Under apartheid, the government labeled everything on her birth certificate, race, tribe, nationality. Everything had to be categorized. My mother lied and said I was born in the semi-sovereign homeland for Swazi people living in South Africa. So my birth certificate doesn't say that I'm Xhosa, which technically I am, and it doesn't say that I'm Swiss, which the government wouldn't allow. It just says that I'm from another country. My father isn't on my birth certificate officially. He's never been my father. And my mother, true to her word, was prepared for him not to be involved. She'd rented a new flat for herself in Joburg Park, the neighborhood adjacent to Hillbrow, and that's where she took me when she left the hospital. The next week she went to visit him with no baby. To her surprise, he asked where I was. You said that you didn't want to be involved, she said, and he hadn't. But once I existed, he realized he couldn't have a son living around the corner and not be part of my life. So the three of us formed a kind of family, as such as our peculiar situation would allow. I lived with my mom. We'd sneak around and visit my dad when we could. Where most children are proof of their parents' love, I was the proof of their criminality. The only time I could be with my father was indoors. If we left the house, he'd have to walk across the street from us. My mom and I used to go to Joburg Park all the time. It's the central park of Johannesburg. Beautiful gardens, a zoo, a giant chessboard with human-sized pieces that people would play. My mother tells me that once, when I was a toddler, my dad tried to go with us. We were in the park. He was walking a good bit away from us, and I ran after him screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy!" People started looking. He panicked and ran away. I thought it was a game and kept chasing him. I couldn't walk with my mother either. A light-skinned child with a black woman would raise too many questions. When I was a newborn, she could wrap me up and take me anywhere, but very quickly that was no longer an option. I was a giant baby, an enormous child. When I was 1, you'd have thought I was 2. When I was 2, you'd have thought I was 4. There was no way to hide me. My mom, same as she's done with her flat and with her maids and uniforms, found the cracks in the system. It was illegal to be mixed to have a black parent and a white parent, but it was not illegal to be colored, to have two parents who were both colored. So my mom moved me around the world as a colored child. She found a crash. She found a crash in a colored area where she could have me while she was at work. There was a colored woman named Queen who lived in our block of flats. When we wanted to go out the park, my mom would invite her to go with us. Queen would walk next to me and act like she was my mother. And my mother would walk a few steps behind like she was the maid working for the colored woman. I've got dozens of pictures of me walking with this woman who looks like me, but who isn't my mother, and the black woman standing behind us who looks like she's photobombing the picture. That was my mom. When we didn't have a colored woman to walk with us, my mom would risk walking me on her own. She would hold my hand and carry me, but if the police showed up, she would have to drop me, pretend that I was in hers, like I was a bag of weed. When I was born, my mother hadn't seen her family in 3 years, but she wanted me to know them and wanted them to know me. So the prodigal daughter returned. Prodigal daughter returned. We lived in town, but I would spend weeks at a time with my grandmother in Soweto. Often during the holidays, I have so many memories with the place set in my mind. It's like we lived there too. Soweto was designed to be bombed. That's how forward-thinking the architects of apartheid were. The township was a city unto itself. With a population of nearly 1 million, there were only 2 roads in and out. That was so the military could lock us in, quell any rebellion. And if the monkeys ever went crazy and tried to break out of their cage, the Air Force could fly over and bomb the shit out of everyone. Growing up, I never knew that my grandmother lived in the center of Bullseye. In the city, as difficult as it was to get around, we managed. Enough people were out and about, black and white and colored, going to and from work, that we could get lost in the crowd. But only black people were permitted in Soweto. It was much harder to hide someone who looks like me, and the government was watching much more closely. In the white areas, you rarely saw the police. And if you did, it was officer friendly in his collared shirt and pressed pants. In Soweto, the police were an occupying army. They didn't wear colored shirts. They wore Viet gear. They were militarized. They operated in teams known as flying squads, because they would swoop in out of nowhere, riding in an armored personnel carriers, hippos. We called them. Tanks with enormous tires and slotted holes in the side of the vehicle to fire their guns out of. You didn't mess with a hippo. You saw one, you ran. That was a fact of life. The township was in a constant state of insurrection. Someone was always marching or protesting somewhere and had to be suppressed. Playing in my grandmother's house, I'd hear gunshots, screams, tear gas being fired onto crowds. My memories of the hippos and the flying squads come from when I was 5 or 6, when apartheid was finally coming apart. I never saw the police before that, because we could never risk the police seeing me. Whenever we went to Soweto, my grandmother refused to let me outside. If she was watching me, it was, no, he doesn't leave the house. Being the wall in the yard, I could play, but not in the street. And that's where the rest of the boys and girls were playing, in the street. My cousins, the neighborhood kids, they'd open the gate and head out and roam free and come back at dusk. I'd beg my grandmother to go outside. Please, please, can I go play with my cousins? No, they're going to take you. For the longest time, I thought she meant that the other kids were being taken. Children were taken. The wrong color kid in the wrong color area, and the government could come in, strip your parents of custody, haul you off to an orphanage. To police the township, the government relied on its network of impipists, the anonymous snitches who would inform on suspicious activity. There were also the blackjacks, the black people who worked for the police. My grandmother's neighbor was a blackjack. She had to make sure he wasn't watching when she smuggled me in and out of the house. My gran still tells the story of when I was 3 years old and fed up with being a prisoner. I dug a hole under the gate in the driveway, wriggled through, and ran off. Everyone panicked. A search party went out and tracked me down, and I had no idea how much danger I was putting everyone in. The family could have been deported. My gran could have been arrested. My mom might have gone to prison, and I probably would have been packed off to a home for colored kids. So I was kept inside. Other than those few instances of walking in the park, the flashes of memory I have from when I was young are almost all indoors. Me with my mom in her tiny flat, me by myself at the grounds. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know any kids beside my cousins. I wasn't a lonely kid. I was good at being alone. I'd read books, play with my toy that I had, make up imaginary worlds, and I lived inside my head. I still live inside my head to this day. You can leave me alone for hours and I'm perfectly happy entertaining myself. I have to remember to be with people. Obviously, I was not the only child born to black and white parents during apartheid. Traveling around the world today, I meet other mixed South Africans all the time. Our stories start off identically. We're around the same age. Their parents met at some underground party in Hillbrow or Cape Town. They lived in an illegal flat. The difference is that in virtually every other case they left. The white parents smuggled them out through Lesotho or Botswana, and they grew up in exile in England or Germany or Switzerland because being a mixed family under apartheid was just that unbearable. Once Mandela was elected, we could finally live freely. Exile started to return. I met my first one when I was around 17. He told me his story and I was like, wait, what? You mean we could have left? That wasn't an option? Imagine being thrown out of an airplane. You hit the ground and break all your bones, and you go to hospital and you heal and you move on and finally put the whole thing behind you, and then one day somebody tells you about parachutes. That's how I felt. I couldn't understand why we'd stayed. I went straight home and asked my mom, why? Why didn't we just leave? Why didn't we go to Switzerland? Because I am not Swiss, she said. As stubborn as ever. This is my country. Why should I leave? South Africa is a mix of the old and the new, the ancient and the modern. The South African Christianity is a perfect example of this. We adopted the religion of our colonizers, but most people held on to the old ancestral ways too, just in case. In South Africa, faith in Holy Trinity exists quite comfortably alongside belief in witchcraft, in casting spells and putting curses on one's enemies. I come from a country where people are more likely to visit sangomas, traditional healers known as witch doctors, than they are to visit doctors of Western medicine. I come from a country where people have been arrested and tried for witchcraft in a court of law. I'm not talking about 17s. I'm talking about 5 years ago. I remember a man being on trial for striking another person with lightning. That happens a lot in the homelands. There are no tall buildings, few tall trees, nothing between you and the sky, so people get hit by lightning all the time. And when people get killed by lightning, everyone knows it's because somebody used Mother Nature to take out a hit. So if you had a beef with the guy who got killed, someone will accuse you of murder and the police will come knocking. Mr. Noah, you've been accused of murder. You used witchcraft to kill David Kibuka by causing him to struck by lightning. What is the evidence? The evidence is that David got struck by lightning and it wasn't even raining. And you go to trial. The court is presided over by a judge. There is a docket. There is a prosecutor. Your defense attorney has to prove lack of motive. Go through the crime scene. Forensics present a staunch defense, and your attorney's argument can't be witchcraft isn't real. No, you lose.